you.
My name is Zachary Morris, and I'm here in the capacity of Vice President of the Australasian Union of Jewish Students.
Thanks, Mr. Morris.
Noah Lovin, President of the Australasian Union of Jewish Students.
Thank you, Mr. Lovin.
Professor Stephen Prower, Co-Director of the Australian Alliance Against Antisemitism.
Thank you. And on video conference?
I'm Associate Professor Efrat Eilam, Director of the Australian Academic Alliance Against Antisemitism.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Now, before we go to questions from senators, do you have a brief opening statement you'd like to make? Would you like to start with the Students' Association? Thank you. Mr. Lovin, over to you.
I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I'd like to acknowledge the long-standing friendship between Indigenous and Jewish communities. Thank you, Committee Chair Senator Green, Deputy Committee Chair Senator Scarr, and the Committee for allowing AUJS to contribute to this inquiry. Today, we are here to amplify the voices of Jewish students and make it very clear that the current situation is untenable. We are in a crisis, and this crisis has gone on for far too long. The failure of many Australian universities to address rising anti-Semitism has allowed anti-Semitism to become further entrenched. Jewish students are avoiding campus, fearing for their safety, with many going and removing identifiable Jewish symbols. It is unacceptable and can no longer be ignored. Universities, which should be sanctuaries for learning, have become places for fear and exclusion for Jewish students. Today, you'll hear many voices. Zach and I stand here as the elected representatives of Jewish students, chosen through a democratic process by a national executive, campus, and regional presidents. AUJS is the only organisation here that represents Jewish students. We know that the committee, and we trust the committee, will determine adequately the weight you afford to these different perspectives. Across these past 11 months, we've seen a range of responses to anti-Semitism by universities. Some have stepped up, but others have allowed this hate to fester, excusing anti-Semitic chants, deferring responsibility, and letting Jewish students fend for themselves. There is no justification for this inconsistency. Jewish students should not have to choose between their education and their safety. We recognise the challenges that universities face, but we refuse to accept the false dichotomy between freedom of speech and protection. We can hold two truths. Not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, but some undeniably crosses the line. Universities must recognise this tension and disregard extreme views on both sides of the spectrum. Using the right tools, such as the IRA definition, can help address these issues, but we know it's no silver bullet. We fully support the right to protest, but when protests glorify violence against Jews, insult or harass them, deface campuses with swastikas, it crosses a line. This is not protest, and it's intimidation, which is designed to silence Jewish students and exclude them from university life. We now have a choice: to work constructively to improve campus life for all students, or to play politics and erode the principle of prosecuting ideas, not people. While there may not be a perfect solution, inaction is the wrong one. We welcome your questions and are ready to expand on our submission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from the Australian Academic Alliance Against Anti-Semitism, do you have a brief opening statement?
We do.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation to give evidence at this public hearing. The Australian Academic Alliance Against Anti-Semitism was formed by Jews and non-Jews in the aftermath of 7 October as a response to the overwhelming rise in anti-Semitism on campuses. In this part of the hearing, we'll focus on two critical issues: Jewish people are not feeling safe on campuses, and the systemic failure of many universities to protect Jewish staff and students. Our recent survey on campus anti-Semitism found that a substantial percentage of Jewish students and staff do not feel safe. We have countless reports of Jewish students being singled out in classes by lecturers and peers, spat on, and told that they have no right for cultural safety. In many classes, they are forced to listen as captive audiences to inaccurate xenophobic attacks on Jews by their lecturers. Similarly, academic staff are being targeted by students and peers and subjugated to a Jewish cancel culture that has taken over many campuses. Not surprisingly, our survey shows that a high percentage of Jewish students report reduced class attendance and the need to hide their Jewish identity. Is this a tolerable situation? To put this in perspective, the 2021 National Student Safety Survey into sexual harassment found that 84% of students felt safe at their universities. But the fact that less than 6% did not feel safe was considered completely unacceptable and prompted universities across Australia to adopt a zero-tolerance policy on sexual harassment. Unfortunately, in many universities across Australia, the Jewish minority is not afforded the same treatment. With more than a third of Jewish students and staff report feeling unsafe on campuses, many universities across Australia refuse to even acknowledge and take action on the problem, often misusing the notion of free speech to obscure the responsibility to maintain a safe and secure environment for all. The discrimination against Jewish people is so pervasive on some campuses that even the systems designed to ensure justice and ethical conduct are used to discriminate against them. In some universities, the complaint systems are failing to protect Jewish students in need and may even be weaponized to silence Jewish students. Not surprisingly, 50% of Jewish students rank the university's actions on anti-Semitism as 0 to 2 out of 10. Most of them express distrust in the complaint systems. In conclusion, universities are currently undergoing an anti-Semitic crisis, a crisis which they are failing to deal with. A judicial inquiry is essential to ensure that the true extent of anti-Semitism and threatening behavior on campuses is ascertained, with students and staff given a full opportunity to recount their experiences and university officials given the opportunity to explain their system's failure to address a crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that opening statement, for both of those opening statements. Now, as Chair, and I think the Deputy Chair, we both have questions, but Senator Henderson, as you know, is the mover of the bill, so we might give her the call first to ask you some questions, and then we'll come back. And we have pretty limited time with each panel today, but we'll get through it. Thank you. Senator Henderson, you have the call.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, and I greatly appreciate you being here this morning. Firstly, to Mr Lovin and Mr Morris, what difference would a judicial inquiry make, do you believe, given the crisis of anti-Semitism on Australian university campuses?
I think it's important that we acknowledge, in the context of all of this has been going on for 11 months and is precipitated by a complete lack of trust in the existing university systems, as our cries for help have fallen on deaf ears effectively. As I'm sure you can appreciate as well, this has been politicised in a way that it has become a contentious issue, such that there is a lot of noise and a lot of interest that are distracting from here. One of the reasons why we directly would request a judicial inquiry is because we are in a point where we need to be doing everything we can. We believe that this is something that is going to be trusted, it's going to be independent, and is going to allow the opportunity for students to be able to give evidence in confidence. We don't believe, as we said, there is such a fear of retaliation and victimisation, which we have seen at universities when students have reported things, that unless we can have that confidence and that independence guaranteed, we are not going to be able to get to the bottom of this. We need a form of truth-telling here as well, right, so that way we have a shared kind of base and an understanding which we can all go off so we can look at solutions to this. And that's why we need a judicial inquiry.
Mr Lovin, I'm alarmed by your opening statement when you say that Jewish students are being forced to choose between their education and their safety. Can you elaborate on that?
What we've seen, as outlined in the introduction, is that because of the heightened tension on campus over these past 11 months, and universities not intervening and not protecting Jewish students are having to fend for themselves. What that means is that, as I said, they are removing identifiable symbols, and it's completely unacceptable. They are reverting from university life. They are not engaging in university life because they are scared to engage with it in the first place. It has come to the point where Jewish students do not feel safe in the university environment, and that is unacceptable. is unacceptable for any minority group. And so we feel that this judicial inquiry is a way to expose the true scale of what is happening on campus and to provide solutions so Jewish students start to come back onto campus, start to feel like they are welcomed again, and to contribute adequately to university life and then to broader society.
On behalf of Jewish students, how do you feel with the news that the expulsion of the student at ANU who outwardly supported Hamas has now been revoked, and that particular student is running for ANU Student Association President?
It is completely unacceptable. What we're talking about here is not an academic infringement such as plagiarism, which is personal. This student went on national radio and declared their unconditional support for Hamas. Now, between then and now, there's been no attempt to engage by that person with the Jewish community to apologise. We're talking about the deficiencies of universities. This is a deficiency in the reporting process. When it's something of this scale, the Jewish community needs to understand and needs to know why the situation has gotten to where it is, why specific actions were taken in terms of her being able to come back onto campus. But also, the situation now for ANU students, for Jewish and Israeli students, is that they know that this person is walking around on campus, is not only walking around on campus, but now is running for president of a student political ticket that is labelled Globalize the Resistance for Palestine. This is clear intimidation for Jewish students, and for ANU it is particularly more egregious because unlike other universities, we can kind of go back to our communities, go back to our safe spaces. Jewish students at ANU have to live on campus. They have to live within the environment of the heightened tension. There is no escape for them. And it is a testament to the resilience of ANU Jewish leaders and Jewish students that they are still there, they are still being loud, and they're still being passionate, because that is a way to fight against what we are seeing on campus. But coming back to the question, it is unacceptable.
So I just want to draw, and I'm going to have to move through these things very quickly. The University of Sydney's Vice-Chancellor Mark Scott defended his lack of action in relation to the presence of members of the extremist group Hitzbat Tahrir on campus when he said, well, they're not a designated terrorist group. I find that absolutely appalling that the university did not act for so many weeks. Can I ask your response in relation to that issue and other issues, particularly at the University of Sydney, the children chanting Intifada at the protest, the barricading of the two Tel Aviv University academics? I mean, there's just been some horrendous incidents with the most lacklustre and appalling response from the university. Could I ask you to comment on that?
Mr. Morris, before you begin, Senator Henderson, you will assist the witnesses in them being relevant to the bill if you phrase your question, maybe a little statement at the end, to make sure that the answers that are being given are relevant to the bill.
Thanks, Chair. Look,
if you could assist the witnesses in that way.
Well, Chair,
I understand the context.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and I do.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Chair. But I do have the call, and these issues are at the very heart of why a judicial inquiry is required, and that's because of the lack of action from the University of Sydney and ANU and other universities, Chair. So I would ask the students. Sorry, I do have the call, Chair. And
I am the Chair. So when I speak, you don't have the call. Actually, what I'm asking you to do.
Point of order, Chair.
No, Senator Henderson.
Point of order.
Senator Henderson, we are
point of order.
15 minutes into the inquiry.
Yeah, sorry, Chair. You can't just interrupt my questioning.
I'm not.
Okay. Well, I would just ask you to give me the call. These are very relevant questions, so please let me ask my questions.
Senator Henderson, I am asking you as Chair to assist the witnesses in being relevant to the inquiry by making sure that we can ask relevant questions.
Thank you.
I know that your questions are relevant.
Thank you, Chair. Well,
and I am asking you to help the witnesses to
I am helping the witnesses.
Answers.
And so please, Chair, let me ask my questions.
I'm letting you ask your questions.
I go back to my question.
Yeah.
And my question is, given some of the horrific incidents we've seen at the University of Sydney, the barricading of academics from the Tel Aviv University, the encouragement of children to chant Intifada, the failure to remove members of the extremist group Hitzbat Tahrir, shocking, appalling conduct by the University of Sydney as one instance. What do you say to that?
Senator and Chair, I would say we have been dealing with a lot of universities in this country. I can say with confidence that the University of Sydney is probably one of the worst places to be a Jewish student right now, and that Mark Scott has failed his students. We have tried repeatedly to engage. After the first meeting with him, his Chief of Staff had to apologise for his behaviour as soon as he left the office. What we've been seeing at the University of Sydney has been problematic for a long time, but there has been a dramatic escalation post the 7th of October. And there have been repeated, and the issue is no longer with what is happening with the students. The issue is in terms of how the administration has responded. When it comes to the graffiti tunnel, and despite assurances that we've been provided that it would be monitored every day, there were swastikas there that maintained and remained there for 2 weeks. We have had students who have been followed, who have been filmed to the point where they have gotten so many death threats from being doxxed that the police have told them it's no longer safe for them to leave their houses. We are in situations where you have academics who are terrified to leave their offices because of other academics who are making their lives miserable. And I think the most important thing is when we talk about that kids' excursion, that there is such... The way the UCID administration has responded to this is by buck passing and trying to find every excuse to avoid responsibility. And apart from feeling from a Jewish student perspective that it's negligent, it's outright offensive, right? Because when you're having, Il Mayam and Al Maya Palestine Arabiya chanted, which is not from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, but from the river to the sea, Palestine will be Arab, which is a call for ethnic cleansing, and the Vice-Chancellor is saying it means different things to different people. That's incredibly offensive. If it was just about flags or just about being offended, though, we wouldn't be here. We're here because there is a marked reduction in student attendance at the University of Sydney because they are made to feel unsafe, they are intimidated, and it is a hostile environment.
I am so sorry to know what you have endured, particularly since the 7th of October last year. Can I ask about the University of Melbourne, the barricading of the building, the occupation of that building, and also the refusal of universities more generally to act to remove the encampments and the impact of the encampments on Jewish students? And could you please perhaps explain your response when the university said, well, everyone has a right to protest? I do say some universities like Monash and Deakin and others moved quite quickly to shut down the encampments, but for many weeks where encampments were allowed to be established at ANU, the University of Melbourne and the University of Sydney.
After October 7th, AUJS was very proactive in ensuring that we and our students met with the university administrations. And from a Jewish student perspective, we know how these things operate. When there's conflict in the Middle East, there is residual effects on our campuses here. So we made that proactive step and we met with administrations. And with the University of Melbourne specifically, we clearly say to them, if there's not red lines when it comes to protests, things will get out of hand. Unfortunately, that is what happened. The University of Melbourne, while evidently kept open lines of communication with Jewish students, instituted good reforms such as special considerations, and generally had that good productive relationship, they failed to institute clear red lines. And in every instance where they could have intervened, they chose the path of least resistance. Those egregious steps over red lines in terms of events coming from the encampment, chance to globalise the Intifada, which, as we said, is egregious and not a moral relativist term. It is very clear what that means to the Jewish community. It means the glorification of terror against Jews and Israelis. We saw that constantly, that tension build up to the point where a building had to be rendered unusable for a few days in the lead up to final assessments and exams. That means students could not attend class in the lead up to their exams, which is, I think it really reinforces this is not a Jewish student issue. This is an all of student issue to ensure the safety of all students on campus.
Now, I apologise, we've got very limited time, and I do want to ask the Australian Academic Alliance Against Antisemitism a couple of questions, but we really, really appreciate your time here this morning, and thank you for all that you have done on behalf of all Australian University Jewish students. Professor Pora and Associate Professor Ilam, could you please explain the impact on Jewish staff at universities? Obviously, you had to establish this organisation in the first place to advocate for your rights, but how have universities failed Jewish staff?
If I might, Senator, I'd like to just convey something that happened to me last week. I was escorted from my office by security who chose to evacuate me from my office because a group of students had identified me personally and were marching on my office in physics. And subsequently, I had a security guard outside of my office for the next 3 days as we were fearful that students would try to break into my office. Now, I'm not an administrator. I am in charge of the academic lead of the program with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, joint PhD, supporting students to do their research with the Hebrew University. The students identified me personally, and the university system kicked in to try to protect my safety. I'm a senior professor at the university.
At which university, sorry?
University of Melbourne. You can well imagine that if this could happen to me, what a chilling effect this has on other members of staff who are more vulnerable, who are less senior, who feel that they can no longer exercise their academic freedom to, for example, collaborate with Israeli colleagues.
So was there any action taken against the threats imposed by those students?
Yes, the university, well, firstly, the university is doing its very best to identify the students. It's a shadowy group called the Students Against Warfare, and they somehow have conflated the activities of the university in collaborating with defence organisations with the Hebrew University. They accuse the Hebrew University of being a source of genocide, and I have the flyer here that identified me personally. But to answer your question, Senator, to attack a personal individual who is fulfilling their academic duties in terms of supporting students doing their PhD, I think was outrageous. Not to mention the students who are actually on campus who are undertaking the PhD. Just imagine them walking past those posters.
Could we possibly have a copy of that flyer? Is that
Yes.
appropriate? Thank you. If you could just circulate that. And if I could just briefly go to you, Associate Professor Ilam, can you explain from your perspective your experience since October 7?
So our survey data reveals harrowing experiences, and I can just read a few quotes taken from our data. These are quotes by academics about their experience. So, for example, being doxed on Twitter by a senior professor in my faculty and the university failing to reprimand him or order him to take down for 6 months. Another academic, my Jewish colleague, had a petition signed against him. Another one, we have academics who do not hesitate to use the staff communication channels to scream this doublespeak and to harass and vilify and berate all who object. A Jewish colleague has had an office door trashed. I was assaulted by a Deakin student who I have reported internally and provided several witnesses. And I was also attacked by a professional protester. And so on it goes. So I think that those quotes speak for themselves. They speak volume.
Look, at this point, where others need to ask questions, I will hand the call back to the Chair.
If you have a couple more questions, you have time. Yeah, we've got until 9:15.
All right, okay. All right, well, in that case, if I could...
I've got a few more, and then I'll hand to Paul. But if you
why don't I hand to Senator Scarr now, and then...
Yeah, well, I'll take the call then, if that's okay, Senator. And we have time, we'll come back to you, Senator.
Thank you. I would like to ask a few more questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your evidence, and I am so sorry to read about the accounts from your submission and the ones that you've given us today. It is not comparable, but I've had my office protested on this issue many times, so I understand a little bit about what it might be like. And I I'm not sure if you're aware. Did you see the evidence from the Special Envoy? Yes. So part of that discussion, the Deputy Chair and I led an inquiry into sexual harassment on campus. And so the issue around the way that universities deal with complaints of this type of nature is very alive to us. And I wanted to ask you some questions about that. What are universities, is there any universal approach from universities around complaints handling? Have you seen, you said that some universities are approaching things in better ways. Do we need a universal best practice policy to make some immediate changes?
So first and foremost, that's a really important starting point, because what we're seeing is inconsistency. And particularly because as we've noted, where that boundary sits in terms of what is considered anti-Semitic or not can be contested. And so you've got 36 universities around the country making 36 different decisions each time, right? And that leads students to feeling, if a decision isn't made correct, like in a way that they would like or one way or another, they then feel pretty abandoned. Having something that's best practice means that we're actually able to identify what are the kind of systemic gaps. One that we've noticed is if an incident is significant enough to be reported to the police, then in that case universities will be reluctant to investigate because they don't want to compromise a police investigation. But then if the police don't follow up on that because of, they don't perceive it as serious enough, then you have this almost issue where the higher the gravity of the incident, the less likelihood it actually gets reported on or followed up.
It falls in the middle of the two jurisdictions.
Mark Scott said after the report on sexual harassment that just one case is too many. And he also said that every student has the right to feel safe and supported and to be treated with respect and dignity. And universities then instituted educational programs compulsorily for both staff and students. And we wonder why is such a large group of students who are screaming that they feel unsafe and discriminated against, why is that being tolerated when sexual harassment is not being tolerated? It also points out that when the universities want to, they can swing into action. And to be fair, many of the universities have reached out to our alliance and have asked us to participate with them in crafting an appropriate educational program on campus. Not all, but some.
Did you want to add to that, Mr. Morris?
Apologies, Chair, what was that?
Yeah.
If I may, I think something that comes to mind is something that really, the issue and the reason why we need consistency is because we need some set of minimum standards.
Yeah.
What we've been seeing, and I'm going to use the University of Sydney as an example, right? Their complaints process, and recently it was shown that one of their acting case managers holds pretty strong views on the conflict, so much so that she had been publicly posting about them, and that's completely fine. Everyone's entitled to hold a view, but students are also entitled to expect that their complaints will be assessed on the merits and that there will be some, impartiality there. And if a view is held so strongly to publicly post about it, it's very much undermining kind of students' beliefs in the robustness of that system. What becomes very, very difficult then is when the university is pointing to the number of unsubstantiated reports, when they've all been, at least from our end, or a significant number, have been reviewed by the same case manager who's now been removed. So things like that really undermine the trust in the system. And what we're now seeing is Jewish students, and particularly when they come to us, they're reluctant to report to the university because they don't believe the university is going to take it seriously. And they also aren't assured of the fact that they won't be victimised or retaliated against by their lecturers, by their peers, or even by the university itself. And so anything we can do to address that problem is crucial.
On the video conference.
Thank you. Our finding actually suggests a systemic failure across many universities in protecting Jewish students and staff. What we find is some of the evidence is, again, the qualitative data is very concerning. For example, an Israeli student who sought assistance from an international student advisor was sent out of her room once their nationality was revealed. The student reported, "The second I said that I was from Israel, her face changed and she just told me she can't help and practically expelled me from her room. And after she closed it, I was stuck in place pretty shocked she screamed something like, "Oh my God." So this discrimination against Jewish people is so pervasive on campuses that even the systems designed to ensure justice and ethical conduct are used to discriminate against them. Recently, we have identified a pattern where when Jewish students respond to aggression, the tables quickly turn around and the aggressors portray themselves as victims and file disciplinary complaints against the Jewish students. Consequently, the disciplinary complaint system becomes weaponized, where the bully becomes the victim and the victim becomes the bully. When such matters arrive at student conduct and complaint department, we have seen a case where the investigation officer failed to treat the Jewish student fairly. Not only the Jewish student was inappropriately found guilty of misconduct, but the report also one-sidedly protected the complainant's freedom of expression while denying the Jewish student the same right to respond to the offense. Consequently, we found that in certain cases, the disciplinary complaint system is compromised by bias.
Okay, thank you. That's a really helpful case study, I think. I think we've all appreciated that. Can I ask, we had evidence from the Special Envoy the other night, which was really helpful setting the scene, I think. Her evidence, I don't want to put words into her mouth, but essentially she had worked with universities in previous roles, but in this role, she's only been in it for 2 months. So we asked her about her intention to work with universities. What would you like to see from the Special Envoy and the universities, and how can that position be used, I think, to start making some inroads into these issues? Professor.
So I think the Special Envoy recognised that anti-Semitism was becoming endemic. The universities is ground zero for the education of our students who will become the leaders of tomorrow. Those students may well be sitting in your seats 20 years from now. And so we have a chance to educate properly. And what we would like from the Special Envoy and from the community at large is to take this problem seriously and to combat it in the same way that we have combated other serious cultural issues such as sexual harassment or, in fact, child abuse in our community. We think that we can do it collectively, and we stand as an alliance certainly ready to put all of our resources into those educational programs. We have to understand the culture of this, but we are very worried about the normalisation of anti-Semitism in the academy. And that is the long-standing danger when statements about Jews and about Israel become normalised that are discriminatory. We have to remember that only 100 years ago Harvard didn't allow Jews, or it restricted the number of Jews coming onto campus. We have to be aware that some universities are perhaps subtly using anti-Jewish to limit the number of Jews entering courses like medicine, for example. We have to be aware of the unconscious bias that is crept into the academy.
Thank you.
I think just have one more question after this, Paul. On the Special Envoy's role, at the end of the day, something that was suggested, I believe, during the evidence is this idea of roundtables and being able to convene all the stakeholders and having a central touch point to be able to ensure that all these interests are met. But I think something that is really important to note is whilst obviously the Envoy will have a very important role in being able to bring everyone together, that role, and whilst she's incredibly accomplished, will not be able to solve this problem as a kind of one-size-fits-all solution. And so I guess we would be reticent from the perspective of students is, at the end of the day, right now the buck rests with the universities. There is a hesitance to kind of point to that role as a way to, as a panacea of sorts.
I just have one more question. Sorry, Senator Scarr, but it's a really interesting discussion. When we were talking about best practice and in the reflections you were having, Professor, around the sexual harassment approach, it occurred to me that last week the government introduced legislation to establish a national student ombudsman, and that's not confined just to matters of sexual harassment. I was wondering at this early stage whether you had a view about whether that, in the way that that is developed, because there's still a code of practice to be developed, whether you'd like to have some input in that and how that could possibly be used as a vehicle to help build that best practice. Professor.
I think it's crucially important that students are able to report their experiences without fear of being identified and fear of being victimised, and they should be able to report those cases even if they're not making a formal complaint that needs to be action, so to speak, and that they're forced to identify themselves and give evidence. In this inquiry, you saw the submissions, hundreds of submissions perhaps, of people that did not want to put their names to their submissions. So I think that's the crucial thing. We want to know the depth of the problem, and we want to know that without fear or favour.
I think that from our perspective, any solution that helps Jewish students on the ground, we'll support. From our perspective, for us to help inform what those terms of reference, what the scope is also very important. For us, we see AUJS as not only a tool to advocate for Jewish students on campus, but for external stakeholders to get an understanding of what the life is for Jewish students on the ground. But with the Ombudsman, with potential reporting in the future, that's still not implemented now. As you've seen from the Special Envoy's our hearing today, this is an immediate problem that requires immediate solutions. Jewish students cannot wait any longer. This is not an October 7th issue. Anti-Semitism on campus has been increasing prior to October 7th. And so while we obviously welcome the reforms in this space, we don't want to wait too long, and we see that we're here before talking about a judicial inquiry. And that is why we want to start on the judicial inquiry. But Zach wants to mention something else.
On the Ombudsman specifically, whilst it's definitely important to address some gaps, and we've been meeting with TEXA and they've been horrified, but they don't have the capacity to enforce or to regulate it. The issue with the Ombudsman is, whilst, it's certainly welcomed, there are also gaps in terms of where that accountability is. A lot of what we're seeing is unfortunately coming from student unions, it's coming from the National Union of Students as well, right? And there is no capacity, as we're seeing with universities, to actually be able to turn around and address that. And from what I've seen with the Ombudsman is it's unclear whether they would have the ability to regulate kind of conduct that affects universities but, is not within the ambit of the university itself or the education provider itself.
Thank you. I do have to hand over to Senator Scarr, who has some questions.
Thank you. And we've got very limited time, so I want to go through a few topics very, very quickly. Mr Morris, I was deeply concerned with the statement you made that when the Jewish Union of Students met with Mr Scott at the University of Sydney, his colleagues had to apologise with respect to his behaviour. What was his behaviour?
I hope you can respect the position I'm in, Senator.
You are under parliamentary privilege.
Of course.
You're a student at the University of Sydney?
No, I'm not. I was representing the Australasian Union of Students when I met with...
Well, Mr Morris, I don't want to put you in a difficult position. If we had time, we could potentially go in camera. Can I invite you to, perhaps through you, Chair, to make a submission, a confidential submission outlining that behaviour? But that really does it concerns me, the statement you made. It concerns me. I can feel the hesitation. It's palpable. So I'm deeply sorry you're in that position. I really am.
And Senator Scarr will have a chance to ask and put these things, so maybe we can even have a discussion during the break.
Well, it's deeply concerning. You, in the submission, the Australasian Union of Jewish Students actually singles out two universities in particular in terms of their lack of response. You give incidents at all universities, but the University of Sydney is one of them, as is the University of Melbourne. How do you respond to the University of Sydney saying, and this is from Mr Scott's letter, throughout we have prioritised the safety and well-being of all members of our community. That's what he says on page 1 of his submission, while at the same time upholding free speech and academic freedom as required by the law and registration standards of the university, end quote. What's your response to that statement?
Statements like that and statements like there is no place for anti-Semitism on campus clearly do not reflect the reality for Jewish students on campus. It honestly feels contemptful the end of the day, because this hasn't been about academic freedom and free speech, because Jewish students have not been able to exercise those rights due to the intimidation they have faced on that campus. So to suggest that there has been, balancing of the well-being of all students when the coin has fallen very clearly on one side, consistency over the last 11 months, it's laughable.
Yeah, thank you. Is one of the reasons why we need an independent judicial inquiry, is one of the reasons we need that inquiry that academics and students need to have a safe forum in relation to convey their complaints, convey their situations, convey their experiences to someone independent from the university so that they have confidence that they will not be subject to persecution or victimisation or discriminatory behaviour in response to them having made those complaints or giving that testimony? Is that one of the fundamental reasons why we need a judicial inquiry? Professor?
Yes.
Mr Morris? Unequivocally.
Is another reason why we need an inquiry is we need a judicial inquiry so it has the powers to actually obtain documentation and other evidence under force of law to actually get to the bottom of this issue. Because without a judicial inquiry, you simply don't have the powers to delve into what is actually happening within the universities, including when complaints are made. Professor?
Yes, and I'll just add quickly, we don't have access to, for example, the ANU internal process that turned an expulsion into reverse that expulsion. We just are not privy, we're not able to get access to it, and the university claims confidentiality, so their processes are opaque to us.
Mr Morris?
Universities have so far, and a lot of them demonstrated, they would prefer. They've been completely reticent and reluctant to. So unequivocally, yes, is the answer.
And my last question, because yes.
Again, similar to what has been said, we do not have access to what is happening with our complaints. When we lodge complaints to universities, we never receive response. We do not know how they are being treated. And also, anti-Semitism on campus is a unique issue on its own, and therefore the notion that it can be diluted or dispersed under other kind of investigations is probably not the most effective way to deal with this very unique problem with the unique characteristics of anti-Semitism and campuses.
Okay, last question. We have another panel which we need to get to. Is one of the reasons why we need an independent judicial inquiry is one of the reasons there is, as a matter of fact, there's a lack of confidence in the Jewish community, including amongst Jewish academics and Jewish students, that the Australian Human Rights Commission is the right forum to engage in that inquiry. Professor?
Yes.
Mr Morris?
Regrettably, but yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you very much, Senator Scott, and thank you for appearing today. My colleagues don't know this, but my first press conference was 20 years ago protesting safety of LGBTI students on campus. So I know it's a really difficult and fraught thing that you are doing. So thank you for appearing. I appreciate it.